Well, good morning. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to be able to talk at the centre. I'm going to start with about 6 weeks ago, Susanna came to our Wednesday meeting with a new copy of, newly released publication of a work by Denis. I'm not sure how much knowledge you have of this gentleman, but when I started to read that book the same night I received it, I was just literally blown over by so many different levels. And then a couple of weeks later, I received a text from Susanna saying, could I do a talk this month? And my thoughts went to doing something in the scientific side of Spiritism, which really interests me. But I thought it would be opportune to try and convey to you some of the beauty in the work that Leon did and his contribution to Spiritism. So that I'm going to try and share with you today. It's a little challenging. Obviously in 45 minutes, I'm only going to scratch the surface. But I hope I can convey some of the beauty and the depth of knowledge that's particularly in this book, but in other books that he wrote. And I certainly am going to try and read many more books of his. So let me start off. Again, I'm going to do it's an introduction to his life, and I'm going to go into a little bit into this book, After Death. But he was known as the consolidator of Spiritism. And the reason for that is that we all know that Allan Kardec was the codifier. He set the basis. He brought the knowledge from the spirits and introduced us to Spiritism. But what Denis was, he was more like a disciple in a way, analogous to the disciples of Jesus. He went out after Denis, after Allan Kardec passed on, and he spent the next 20 years spreading the gospel, as it were, spreading the message of Spiritism. And it was very much, in fact, it's questionable who was more a bigger contribution, Allan Kardec or Leon Denis. And his book, this After Death, is such an amazing book. And I tried to find a way to bring it to you, try and summarize it, but I felt I'd just do an injustice. So I'm going to there's quite a bit of reading today. I'm going to read my favourite passages from the book. I'm going to ask Susanna and John just to share the burden a little bit and read a bit for me. But I hope you'll get appreciation of this mammoth work that he did. So I'm going to start right off with an introduction from the book. And Leon says the following: we offer this doctrine capable of transforming the face of societies to all sorts of researchers of all levels. It has already been disclosed in several books. We took to heart the task of summarizing in the following pages in a different form, with the intention that those who are tired of living blindly, ignoring themselves, those who are no longer satisfied with the achievements of a materialistic civilization that is about appearances, will aspire to a more elevated order of things. It is, above all, for you, sons and daughters of the people, workers for whom the road is steep and life is hard, for whom the sky is darker and the adversity of the wind is colder. It is for you that this book was written. It will not contain the entire science. The human brain would not be able to comprehend it. But it might be one step further in the direction of the true light. By proving that life is neither irony of fate nor the result of a mindless chance, but is rather the consequences of a just and fair law. By opening bright perspectives on the future, it will provide a nobler motivation to your actions. It will ignite a ray of hope in the night of your uncertainties. It will lighten the burden of your trials and teach you not to tremble in the face of death. Open trustingly, read it attentively, because it comes from a man who wants good things for you above all else. Many of you may reject our conclusions. Only a small number will accept them. It doesn't matter. We are not seeking success. Only one motive inspires us: the respect of love of the truth. We are driven by a sole ambition. When our used physical envelope shall return to dirt, we would like our immortal spirit to be able to say, my passage down here has not been fruitless. If I have succeeded to appease one single pain, to enlighten one intelligence seeking truth, or to comfort even only one faltering soul. And I think that at various levels that captures the whole essence of his work. First of all, as you read the book, it is very clear, the message is a lot clearer. When you're comparing with Kardec, and I don't mean to diminish Kardec in any way, but with the questions and answers, and then the Gospel, and then Genesis, which is a difficult book to understand, I think Leon really puts it in a very easy manner. It's very easy, very readable, very flowing, and he really reinforces the message of what Spiritism is all about. On another level, I think also, it's a tremendous literary prose. It's almost poetic. But I think even someone who is maybe new to Spiritism or even disagrees with Spiritism cannot deny the beauty in the words. And it is a joy to read. And at one last level, you can also see the dedication that he put into consolidating the Spiritist message. He spent almost 60 years of his life totally dedicated to the work. And that shines throughout the book. So, I want to talk a little bit about his background. Born 1846, he lived till he was 81, which is quite a ripe old age in those days. Born in the north of France, in a city called Fouges, which is in the northeastern part of France. And it's interesting to compare and contrast with Kardec. Leon came from a very, very poor family. In fact, he even didn't complete schooling because he had to support the family through his own manual labor. So he had a minimal amount of schooling. But yet, from an early age, he sensed the presence of what he called the invisible friends. He didn't know anything about Spiritism at that time, but he kept hearing voices from a very early age. And he was self-taught. He did not had minimum of schooling, but he had an avid passion for reading and reading and reading, and he sought out the best books he could find. He was not like a normal child. He was vegetarian. He didn't play with the other children, didn't partake or indulge in fermented drinks, as quoting from one of the biographies I found. And at 18, he started working as a sales rep, which, considering his background, that was quite surprising in that he could get a job of that nature. And that involved a lot of travel around France, gave him a little minimum income, and he used to spend that on buying books and reading. So the work as a sales rep gave him the opportunity to visit many places and find the books that he wanted, but also the time in traveling to study more and more. And also at 18, he came across the Spirits book. So he was then, 64. So the Spirits book had been out only a few years at that time. But he was able to find a copy, and he immediately realized that what his mission was in life. So he read that avidly, and he said, quote, "I found in this book the clear solution, complete and logical, to a universal problem. My conviction became strong and sound. The Spiritist theory dissipated my indifference and my doubts." So that really he committed himself from there on to promulgating the Spiritist doctrine. He then realized as well, through reading the Spirits book, that he had mediumistic potential and faculties very strong. In fact, he realized he was actually a clairvoyant. He was seeing spirits, and he started to write psychograph through various spirits, even at this early age, in his early 20s. He had the opportunity to actually meet with Allan Kardec in Tours in 1867, which was like a couple of years before Kardec passed on. And he went to Tours because there was a big meeting of the Spiritist group there. In fact, it was supposed to take place in the City Hall in Tours. But the authorities, if you had a meeting of any over 20 people, had to be approved by the authorities, and the authorities did not approve the meeting. So they went to a house of a friend of Kardec's who had a big courtyard. And in fact, about 300 people turned up in the end. And Leon Denis actually wrote a few words on his impressions of that meeting. So he's talking about Kardec. Several questions were put to him, and he answered kindly, smiling. And the important thing was the success of the night, perpetual and indelible memory. He told us about obsession, and several questions were put to him, which he always responded kindly. After the meeting, everyone left with unforgettable memories of that memorial night. I came across an article by Brazilian spiritist Eduardo Carvalho, who he's still in Brazil now, and he went to Lyon, 2 tours, to find out more about Leon's life and referenced that particular night. And he actually visited the house, the Spiritual Villa, it was called. And there was a big courtyard, and there was some other comment in there about, it was this beautiful, imagine this French courtyard, but 300 people packed in, and they destroyed all the plants and the flowers because it was so full in there. So he had 2 other meetings with Kardec, which I couldn't find no documentation about. But one of the things that is often talked about in Spiritism was Leon a plan B? Was he the backup for Kardec? If Kardec was, although he came in his incarnation as the missionary of Spiritism, what if he failed? And there's a lot of literature that suggests that Leon was the backup plan. But fortunately, Kardec, and even though he was in his 50s before he started the spirits, you would say, woke him up through the wrappings and the seances, and eventually got involved with that and then changed his whole course of life. We know that Kardec was a strong Catholic, made a tremendous contribution. And again, comparing and contrasting, Kardec came from a wealthy family, studied at university, he was a doctor, he spoke 5 languages, he had the privilege of studying with Pestalozzi in Switzerland, who was a great advocate of a new way of approaching education, and he took that back to France and Germany and so on. But he was only in his 50s when Kardec finally started to work on Spiritism. Also, there's a lot of spiritual message about Leon was the reincarnation of John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was a scholar in the 14th century, scholastic philosopher, theologian, and he's better known for translating the Bible into English. It was the first copy of the Bible. He himself, supposedly, John Wycliffe, translated the 4 Gospels, which is perhaps the major thing that we, as Spiritists, celebrate and study today. And he also attacked very much very critical of the Church, the Roman Catholic Church at that time, their dominance, their power. And in fact, after he passed on, which was, I've got a picture of him here, there he goes, 1384, later on, about 10 years afterwards, the Pope in Rome ordered that all his writings would be burnt. And in fact, his body was exhumed 15 years after he died and burnt also. So he was considered an enemy of the Catholic Church. But again, and I think I'll try and point out later on when we come on to after death, I think some of that thought process of John Wycliffe passed through to Leon Denis. So after he got introduced to Spiritism, he basically spent the next 20 years traveling around, not just in France, but out of France. And again, considering that he had so little education, he was obviously a tremendous orator. He spoke very well, and he kept being invited to other meetings. And then the next milestone was when he was 36 years old. He received a message from his guide, his best friend, his spiritual teacher, which was Jerome of Prague. Go, my son, follow the open road before your eyes. I will walk behind you to support you. And again, Jerome of Prague, he was Czech, and again, he was a reformer. He actually studied at Oxford later on and followed on the work of John Wycliffe. It's amazing how when you look at all these past incarnations, how they're all connected. And we hear in Spiritism so much that when we pass on to the spirit world, we're attracted to those people of the same level, the same affinities. And all these major spiritist people were all connected at some time in their past lives. And that comes very clear. So again, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Jerome, okay? So he was actually burnt at the stake for his heredity to the church. He was also a follower of Jan Hus, which was another great reformer. He carried on, Jerome followed on the work of Jan Hus, and we'll come back to talk about Jan Hus later. So his first book was actually The Purpose of Life. That was 85, so he was already in his just about 40 years old. And then he went on to write Here and After. Here and After was actually the predecessor of this one. This translation, they call this one After Death. The other English translation was translated as Here and Hereafter. And the third book that's been translated into English is Joan of Arc. That's one of my next one on the list to read. I've heard it's an amazing book. Cicero, who's helped me a little bit with this talk today, tells me a lot about Joan of Arc, and you, Fatima, you've read that too many times, right, in Portuguese. As we know, she was a heroine of France, but she also a really talented medium. And in spite of that, she was canonized by the Catholic Church. And the original translation to English was by Arthur Conan Doyle, who we may know as the writer of, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. But he was also a scientist, a doctor, a member of the Royal Society in England, and had a strong interest in the supernatural and paranormal. Talking of Cicero, good morning. I'm glad you're here. You can help me out later, because I'm sure I'm going to get some questions here that only you can answer. Okay? So after the war, he died in 1920, sorry, eyesight was failing, and probably because of all the studying he was doing in the early ages, his younger years. He started to learn Braille, but in spite of that, he rose to some high positions in the Spiritist Federation in France and internationally. In fact, when he was in his almost 80 years old, he was actually president of the International Spiritist Congress. He suffered quite a bit from pneumonia, had recurring attacks, and that finally is what took him to the next world, as it were. His last words were, "It is necessary to finish, to summarize, and to conclude." And he was actually buried in Tours, in the cemetery, La Salle Cemetery. It's interesting that I went on, tried to find more information about Tours and the cemetery, but I couldn't find anything in the literature. It's surprising for a person that had made such a contribution, not just to Spiritism, but he was a figure. But there's very little information available I could find on Tours, and I don't expect to see plaques of the house where he lived, or at least a picture of his gravestone, but not to be the case. But that wasn't the last we heard from Leon Denis. In the 1940s, Yvonne Pereira, who was a medium in Brazil from Rio, or the area of state of Rio, was a tremendous medium. And she wrote a book which she called Memories of a Suicide. And this was in 1940. And she took it to the Brazilian Spiritist Federation, hopefully to be published. And they rejected it. They rejected on the grounds that, well, she felt that she was a very simple lady, a very simple person, but they felt at the time the book was just too advanced to be published, and they rejected it. And she was obviously totally disheartened about this. And she came home and she prayed. And in her prayers, Leon Denis came to her and said that, don't worry, the book is not complete. We're going to work on this. So for the next 15 years, they worked together on that book. And finally, in 1955, it was published. The original was by, the original spirit was Branco? Right? Yeah, Camilo Branco. But it was a significant contribution from Leon Denis. And then I found another, thank you Cicero for this, but in 2004, in the International Spirit Convention in Paris, where Divaldo Franco was attending. And 2004 was the 200th anniversary of the birth of Allan Kardec. And Divaldo Franco received psychographed a message. And when they came to pick up the paper, I couldn't understand it. Nobody could understand it. And then somebody turned it round, and it was written on the inverse. And on the back was a message from Leon Denis in French. And I'm still getting goosebumps now when I talk about this. And basically, it was a message from Leon Denis saying about they were there to commemorate the anniversary, the 200th anniversary of the birth of Allan Kardec. But he goes back further. He says that Allan Kardec was the reincarnation of Jan Hus, we talked about earlier, who was a great reformer at the same time as Wycliffe and Jerome to Prague. And he said a message that was quite poetic, that it's in French, it's been translated. It says basically, today you cook the goose. The goose in Czech, okay, Hus, his name Hus meant goose. So this is what Jan Hus said about his final, he was killed at the stake, he was burned alive. Okay, so today you cook the goose, but one day you will see the light, that the bright swan has flown so high that the flames will not reach me. So it's a very, very moving message from Leon Denis talking about Allan Kardec, and it's all related. Okay, so just a little comparison about Allan Kardec and how they complemented each other. As I mentioned, Allan Kardec spent 50 years before he got involved in the Spiritist doctrine, and in a period of 12 years, produced the 5 books. Apart from that, of course, he also created and edited and contributed to the Spiritist Review, and that was a monthly magazine over 12 years. In fact, the content of the Spiritist Review, in terms of the amount of words, is almost 10 times more than the 5 books we talk about. There's a huge amount of information in there. It's also interesting to note that the middle part of Allan Kardec's, probably was a pen name, but his real name was Hippolyte Léon Denis Zad Rivail. So the middle part of his name was also Léon Denis, which is maybe more than a coincidence. Again, Léon, 81 years old altogether, wrote a total of 16 books over 30 years. And 3 of them have been translated into English, Here and Hereafter, or Now After Death, which I'm going to talk about a bit more detail, Joan of Arc, and also Life and Destiny. Joan of Arc and Life and Destiny are actually available in a PDF form on the Spiritist website, American Federation. Okay, so the way the book's organised is, first of all, there's an introduction, of which I've previously read a little bit of, and then he goes into 5 parts. Beliefs and Refutations, which really traces religion over the different civilizations. The big issues. This, I suppose, is more like taking some of the content of Genesis, but he talks about God, talks about immortality of the soul, the plurality of existences. And again, I'll come in a little bit more detail later in the talk. Then he gets into the spirit world, talking about spirits, and then the communication. So I think part 3 and part 4, the Spirits book, Heaven and Hell, the Mediums book, all sort of summarised there. And then part 5, which is perhaps the most beautiful part of the whole book, is about the moral aspects of Spiritism. And we're going to read a few passages in there which I think really well illustrate. Then he has a summary and the conclusions. So again, part 1, Beliefs and Refutations. This chapter really resonated with me because I've mentioned before here, I spent 50 years of my life without any influence from any religion, and in fact I rejected religion. And when you read this book, and it talks about how the message was corrupted. Initially the message was very pure, particularly when you go back to India and Brahma, and then later on it got corrupted. And actually recently we've been watching again The Tudors. I don't know if have you ever seen the series The Tudors? It's showing on Netflix again. But it's an amazing series, and we're watching this week how Henry VIII, in his desire to get a son and create a divorce with his first wife and so on. But it illustrates obviously there's a lot of poetic license and drama for the TV, but the message there is there was so much corruption, how the king and the powers in Rome were just corrupt, to just want to maintain that power. In fact, going back to John Wycliffe, they rejected his translation to English because they wanted to keep being able to control the original Latin Bible, shall we say. They didn't want it to go to the masses. They wanted to keep that power. And I think this concept runs all the way through this first chapter. And it goes back to, I think, as I said before, John Wycliffe and others at that time who were trying to address the imbalance of the church and the power of the church. So I'll just read a little bit from this chapter. When taking a comprehensive look at the past and evoking the memories of vanished religions of dead belief, when observing the tortuous ways travelled by human thought, one is taken by some sort of dizzy spell. Yet its pace is slow. Initially, it seemed to reveal itself in the dark crypts of India, the underground temples of Egypt, the catacombs of Rome, the cathedral's self-obscurity. It appears to have preferred obscure sights, the heavy atmosphere of schools, and the silence of cloisters to the daylight and open spaces, or in short, the study of nature. And he goes on to say further at this end of this chapter, all the great religions had two sides, one apparent, the other hidden. In the latter resides the spirit, so the hidden was the spirit, whereas in the former, the flesh, represents the form of the latter, so the material form of the spirit. The deeper meaning was disseminated by material symbols, India's Brahmanism, Egypt's Hermeticism, Greek's polytheism, and even Christianism, originally presented such a double aspect. To judge them by their outer and crude features would be the same as judging a moral value of a man by his garments. In order to know them, one must penetrate the intimate thought that inspires them and is the reason of their existence. So, moving on to chapter 2 again, I'm not going to I haven't got any readings from this, but it's, again, I think it echoes Genesis in a way and leads into the concept of the plurality of existences. Chapter 3 starts to introduce the spirit's world, the invisible world as he calls it, fluids, magnetism, talks about scientific evidences. Spiritism in France, because it really is France at that time, was the centre of Spiritism, obviously following Kardec and the work of Denis. And just like to read just one chapter here, Spiritism and Science. As you know, I like the scientific aspects of Spiritism. Each new step ahead reminds mankind of its limited knowledge. Our own scientific achievements are merely temporary outlines, indeed superior to our forefathers, but which will be displaced by new discoveries and knowledge. Present time is only a phase in the humankind's long journey, only a point in the history of generations. What is utopian today will be tomorrow's reality. One can glorify oneself for having contributed to increase the intellectual capacity of the past, yet no one shall be able to say that what he himself ignores will stay concealed forever. Let us compare the modest range of our science to the infinite of things, to the boundless fields of the unknown that we have yet to explore, and the comparison will teach us to be more circumspect in our judgments. And when you look back at science, we always have this feeling that science is absolute. You take measurements, you have a theory, you can prove the theory, and that was true with Newton. But then it's all transient as well. It's all temporary, because along comes a new science of quantum mechanics, special relativity, and so on. So even today, the bounds of science are still being challenged. The more answers we get, the more questions we find. And even this last week, one of the biggest unknowns about the universe is the question of why the universe is expanding so much, so fast. And it can only be understood through the concept of dark matter and dark energy, which constitute 94% of the universe, of everything. So 94%, we don't know where it is. In fact, this last week there's a new paper published that the rate of expansion is even faster than was originally thought. So that there is so much in science. I like to feel I'm a scientist and it's all very clear and precise. But in fact today science is getting more and more, with more and more unanswered questions. And I still live in the hope that in my lifetime here on Earth that somehow the science and the spirit realm and all these concepts will come together, and I'm sure that'll happen. More and more scientists are looking into what is spirituality, what is the soul, and finding techniques to actually measure and so on. So let's move on. Again, part 4 is the world beyond. He talks about, this is more like heaven and hell, talks about the influence of the two realms. Interesting, this one, the action of humans upon unhappy spirits, and I think this is what we try and do in our mediums group, is to, through contact with the spirits that come to in despair, to help show them, put them back on the right path. And then finally, the straight and narrow, which refers to the Gospels. You can see by all the different chapters here. Each one is really a beautiful reading. I'm going to ask Sandy if you could just read the chapter on love. I think you're very suited to read this one.
Thank you.
Do you want to come up here so we can get it on the mic there?
Is it on there?
Yes, it is. Yeah. There you go.
All right. Deep as the sea and infinite as the sky, love kindles all beings. God is its irradiating center. Just as the sun rises indifferently over all things and heats up the entire nature, divine love vivifies all the souls. Its beams penetrate the darkness of our selfishness and light some flickering glows in the bottom of each human heart. All beings were made for love. Having been fertilized by the supreme fire, the bits of moral life and the seeds of goodness they harbor will develop someday and blossom until they shall be united in a communion of love and in universal fraternity. You who are reading these papers, whoever you might be sure that we will meet one day, either in this world during future existences, or in a more advanced sphere, or even in the immensity of the spaces, that we are intended to influence one another in the path of good and to help each other in our common ascent. We, children of God, members of the great family of the spirits, and who carry the sign of immortality on our brow, we are destined to know each other, to bond into the holy harmony of the laws of things, far from the passions and deceiving splendors of the earth. Until that day comes, may my thought reach you, O brother or sister, as a token of gentle friendship. May it sustain you in your doubts, comfort you in your pains. May it uplift you in your weaknesses, and may it join your own voice for us to bid our common Father help in order to conquer a better future.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Yeah, I think it's an amazing, amazing passage, very moving. And he finishes by summing up the moral laws. And I just want to read this for you. Actually, do you want to read it, John? There you go. Thank you.
Readers, if you want to get rid of your earthly sorrows and avoid painful reincarnations, keep this moral law imprinted inside you and practice it. Grant only the indispensable to the material body, to the transient being that will vanish with death, but cultivate carefully the spiritual being that will live forever. Detach yourselves from the perishable things, honors, wealth, worldly pleasures, for they are only smoke. Only the good, the beautiful, and the truth are eternal. Keep your souls free of blemish and your conscience free of blame. Every evil thought and evil deed attracts the impurities from outside to you. Inversely, every impulse and every effort towards the good strengthens you and makes you communicate with the superior powers. Develop inside you the inward life that points us in relation with the invisible world and the entire nature. It is the source of our true power, simultaneously of joys and exquisite sensations that will grow, while the impressions of the outside life will weaken with old age as one detaches from earthly things. When you pray, listen to the harmony arising from the depths of your being, like the echo of worlds you have dreamt of, or of which you have caught a glimpse, and which tell a tale of great moral struggles and noble actions. Be sure to recognize in these intimate sensations and inspirations, which remain unknown to the sensualists and the wicked, a prelude to the free life of spaces, like a foretaste of the bliss reserved to the righteous and good spirits.
Thank you. So finally, just to conclude, I'll read the last three paragraphs of its conclusion. Remember that life is short. During its course, endeavor to acquire all that you have come to seek in this world, true improvement. May your spiritual being come out of it purer than upon entering it. Guard yourself against the traps of the flesh. Keep in mind that the earth is a battlefield in which the souls remain under the ceaseless assaults of the matter and of the senses. Fight vile passions bravely. Struggle by means of the spirit and the heart. Correct your flaws. Soften your character and strengthen your will. May your mind detach itself from worldly vulgarities and turn to the luminous sky. Remember that everything material is transient. The generations succeed one another like the waves of the ocean. The empires fall. The worlds themselves perish. The sun extinguishes themselves. Everything passes away. Everything fades. Nevertheless, there are things that come from God and are immutable like Him. Three things that shine above all human glories: wisdom, virtue, and love. Put forth the effort to conquer all these three qualities, and upon obtaining them, you will rise above all that is temporary and transient and enjoy all that is eternal. So the three words, I think, if you don't remember anything else today: wisdom, virtue, and love.